It's round one of the fantasy playoffs and every single decision matters now. A few big name players are in much tougher matchups than people realize, and there are some streamers this week who can legitimately carry you through the first round. I'll walk through who gets the green light, who you need to slow down on, and who shouldn't be anywhere near your lineup this week. Let's get into it. Let's start with some green light quarterbacks. Let's start with Marcus Mariota going into New York, going up against the Giants. If you need a quarterback to stream this week, Mariota's your guy. Jaden Daniels has been ruled out. It's going to be the Mariota show with Terry McLaurin, with Deebo Samuel healthy, against the Giants team, giving up the second most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. He's averaging a very solid 18.4 fantasy points per game in his full or near full games this year. He just threw for 294 yards and 2 touchdowns against Denver, along with 55 yards on the ground against them a couple weeks ago, 49 yards on the ground in the game before that. I think he has a pretty high floor in this game. Let's talk about Jaxson Dart at home against Washington. By the way, I think a theme of this show, after preparing for it, is that basically start every one of your Giants and Commanders players. That's pretty much what I got out of it personally. But this is just a reminder that Dart is that guy, right? He just had a down game. He just had the bye. It's been a while, right? Like all the way since week 10, since we've seen those elite fantasy performances, because that's the last time he played, coming back in week 13 and then the bye. But he was the overall QB3 in his full or near full games from week 4 to week 10. So get him back in your lineup against the Washington defense, giving up the 4th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, the 3rd most passing touchdowns per game as well. Don't overthink it. Brock Purdy, another green light quarterback for me at home against Tennessee. Good matchup. Tennessee's given up the 4th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. He's healthier. His weapons are as healthy as they've been all year. Maybe we see Ricky Pearsall actually make an impact, but the 49ers have the 2nd highest implied total for this week. He's a very solid streamer. Don't forget about him. Let's talk about some yellow light quarterbacks. Let's start with Jacoby Brissett going into Houston. I'm tempering expectations here, okay? He's been insanely reliable in every one of his 8 starts this year, including in his first tough test last week against the Rams. Brissett's been the overall QB3 in fantasy points per game since he took over in week 6. Well, it's about to get a bit tougher against a Houston defense who gave Patrick Mahomes fits last week. They're allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. We've seen a couple of quarterbacks have relative success against the Texans, so Brissett isn't a complete avoid this week, but we have to temper expectations if we're going to continue to roll him out. I say continue to start who got you here in the first place, but have to kind of lower expectations a little bit. Another guy I'm lowering expectations on is Dak Prescott at home against Minnesota. He's playing really good football, no doubt about it, but Minnesota is a tough defense, and they've been even better lately. They're only allowing 5.43 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. I'm personally still starting Dak, but we have to temper expectations this week. He's been slinging against single high safety coverage, but the Vikings have deployed that at the lowest rate in the NFL. He's also been slinging against man coverage, but the Vikings play way more zone. So he's still at home, right? The Cowboys have the 6th highest implied team total this week, so I'm still going to be rolling him out. I do have a red light quarterback this week, and that's Jordan Love going into Denver. I think I'm going to try and find a better option over Jordan Love this week. Denver's a pretty tough matchup, and Love hasn't been all that great for fantasy in tough matchups this year. He's playing well, but his good games were against Detroit, Chicago, the Giants, Pittsburgh, Dallas, Washington, but he couldn't get it done against Minnesota at home, Philly at home, Carolina at home, in Cleveland. So I'm going to consider some other options this week. I might take shots on guys like Sam Darnold, guys like Bo Nix, and guys like Brock Purdy. Let's move on to some green light running backs. Let's start with Woody Marks going up against Arizona at home. Nick Chubb is banged up with the rib injury. He's day-to-day currently, and it could be the Woody Marks show against Arizona this week. Chubb left the game early last week. Marks had 26 carries against the Chiefs. He's actually averaging 21 touches over his last 4 games. I would expect that volume to continue, with the Texans favored by 9.5 points at home. Arizona's also allowed the 4th most fantasy points to running backs this year and the 3rd most over the last 4 weeks. Marks has averaged only 3.2 yards per carry over his last 4 games, but he could see his efficiency spike back up, with the Cardinals giving up 5.42 yards per carry over the last 4. That's 2nd most in the NFL. A few yellow light running backs for this week. Chris Rodriguez going into New York, going up against the Giants. Once he took over this backfield, he simply had a string of tough matchups. Seattle, Detroit, Miami, Denver, Minnesota. That's a gauntlet right there. And despite that, he was still able to manage 4.7 yards per carry through those games. So pretty good. And he finally gets a good matchup this week against the Giants, who are giving up the second most fantasy points, both over the course of the season and over the last 4 weeks. They're also allowing the most yards per carry, both over the course of the season and over the last 4 weeks as well. So he's cracking my top 24 this week. Let's talk about the Giants running backs on the other side of the ball. I told you this is going to be a theme of the Giants and the Commanders this week. A little bit of a desperation play, both these guys, both Chris Rodriguez and these running backs, but, and it's tough to decipher this Giants backfield, going into this week, because we've seen Devin Singletary get most of the touches in their last game, even before Tyrone Tracy got hurt. But Tracy's back. He's good to go after getting carted off with that hip injury, but he's fine. I think both running backs are in play against the Commanders defense, who's top 7 in fantasy points per game allowed over the course of the season and over the last 4 weeks. And they're allowing the 5th most rushing yards per game to opposing running backs, so there might be plenty to go around for both of these backs here. Now, it is worth noting that Singletary is the one who had the hot hand in their last game. He is the one who's been getting the majority of goal line looks as well. But in the 2 games before the last one, it was Tracy who averaged almost 135 total yards. So with all that being said, both guys are upside flex plays this week without a lot of certainty going into this game. Let's talk about Rico Dowdle going into New Orleans. I'm tempering my expectations here. In the Panthers' last game, there was a clear workload split between Rico and Chuba Hubbard. They had a ton of combined volume, but Rico only outcarried Chuba 18-17. And both caught both of their targets. Unfortunately for Rico, Chuba outplayed him. In fact, over Chuba's last 4 games, he's averaging 5 yards per carry, where Rico had way more carries than Chuba, so that you have to talk about that. But Rico was only averaging 3.2 yards per carry. It could be why Dave Canales decided to get Chuba more involved in their last game. So it's going to be tough to figure out what kind of split occurs this week, so Dowdle has to be downgraded for now to a hopeful RB2. Now, the Saints have allowed the 3rd most rushing yards per game to running backs this year, 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs over the last 4 weeks. So there's some hope that he can come through regardless. But Hubbard, based on this last game, he continues to be in the flex conversation if he continues to get touches. He's a bit more risky, boom-bust type of play, but it's very possible he continues to get touches. And then we have Omarion Hampton going into Kansas City. I'm also tempering my expectations here. In his first week back, we saw a split in the backfield with Chimere Dike. He saw 69% of the snaps Vidal did, mainly because he was in the field for 27 of the 28 obvious passing downs and 2-minute snaps. As a result, Vidal ran a lot more routes, but the touch distribution was relatively equal, right? Vidal got 17 opportunities to Hampton's 15. Now, the matchup against the Chiefs this week, a lot tougher than what they faced last week, okay? They're allowing only 3.6 yards per carry, only 76 yards on the ground total to running backs per game, and they don't give up a ton of fantasy points either. So because of a potential split again, and against a tough defense, I'm tempering expectations. I have both backs outside my top 24 this week. All right, moving on to some green light wide receivers. Let's start with Terry McLaurin at the Giants. Told you. He got it done big time with Marcus Mariota in a tough matchup against Denver in week 13. 30% target share, 7 catches for 96 yards and a touchdown. This week, he gets the Giants. Not only are they giving up top 5 receiving yards to wide receivers per game, receptions also, both over the course of the season and over the last 4 weeks, by the way. But schematically, this matchup favors McLaurin too. The Giants play the 7th highest rate of single high safety coverage. McLaurin has been way more dominant against that coverage this year than against 2 high. We're talking 31% compared to 18% targets per route run, 2.79 versus 1.5 yards per route run, when comparing single high to 2 high. So I'm firing him up as a wide receiver too this week. And then you have Jaylen Waddle going into Pittsburgh. He had a couple down games, but he bounced back last week against the Jets. He gets the Steelers this week, who've given up the most receptions to wide receivers this year, the 2nd most receiving yards to wide receivers per game as well. Common theme throughout the year, Waddle absolutely goes off against single high safety coverage too. The Steelers played at the 6th highest rate in the NFL, 31% targets per route run for Waddle against that coverage, over 3 yards per route run as well. That is elite. Now, this is a cold weather game for Tua, right? Like a very cold weather game. So I have my concerns there, but the matchup is too good to pass up. Let's talk about Jauan Jennings, green light against Tennessee. He's finished in the top 36 in each of his last 5 games. Since Brock Purdy's return, he's had a 25% target share. So he is very startable against the Titans defense, who are top 10 in fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers this year and over the last 4 weeks, as well as receiving yards per game given up to the wide receiver position too. So, you look at where Jennings lines up. He lined up on the left perimeter and the slot for a total of about 70% of his routes this year. The Titans have specifically given up the most fantasy points to the left side and the 4th most fantasy points to the slot. over the last 4 weeks, respectively. Okay. And then you got Wan'Dale Robinson going up against the Commanders. He's had a relatively high floor with Jaxson Dart this year. His big games have come from like that one big game from Russ, like early on in the year, that Jameis Winston game against the Lions a couple weeks ago. But he's been solid with Jaxson Dart, right? He's averaging a little bit more than 5 catches and 50 yards per game with him. I think the ceiling is a bit higher this week against the Commanders. They give up a ton of production to wide receivers, but they're particularly vulnerable to slot receivers. They're giving up the 5th most fantasy points to the slot this year. Perfectly good low-end wide receiver too this week. Let's move on to some yellow light wide receivers. Wan'Dale's teammate, Darius Slayton. A little bit of a desperate play here for sure, but if you are desperate this week, I think you can fire up Slayton, right? 12.7 fantasy points per game with Jaxson Dart in their last 3 games together. He's targeted down the field, and Washington is particularly vulnerable down the field. They're giving up the 3rd most 40-plus yard passing plays this year, the 5th most 20-plus yard completions as well, and they're very generous in terms of fantasy points per game given up. Slayton is also way better against single high safety coverage than too high. 17% target rate versus 10%, 1.86 yards per route run versus 1.04. He's a solid dart throw this week. I got Chimere Dike in here as well as a deep start going into San Francisco. He's been all over the place this year in terms of production, in terms of volume, all that. But the highs have been pretty good. 4 top 18 finishes over his last 7 games. 33% target share last week. Whether that continues, it's anyone's guess. But this is an overall pretty good matchup for Dike. Negative game script here, obviously, but the 49ers have given up the most fantasy points per game to slot receivers this year. That's where Dike has run 67% of his routes from. If you're looking for a deep start, you can throw him in. I'm going to be tempering expectations on Zay Flowers going into Cincy this week. He had a great game last week against Pittsburgh, but he gets the DJ Turner shadow coverage this week. Again, Turner limited Flowers to only 2 catches for 6 yards 2 weeks ago. He's been one of the better shadow corners this season. By the way, like as bad as the Bengals defense has been this year, they've actually been really stout against wide receivers. And that's including allowing the fewest fantasy points to the position over the last 4 weeks. Not only that, but when we're talking about defending wide receivers, they're a top 5 defense in terms of fantasy points allowed, receptions per game, receiving yards per game, and touchdowns per game allowed. So if you need more upside, I might look elsewhere if possible. I'm also tempering expectations on Christian Watson going into Denver. He has absolutely been on fire, and as usual, we've been depending on the touchdowns. He's averaging only 4.25 receptions per game over his past 4 games, but he's had 5 touchdowns during that span, right? Now, look at where the touchdowns have come. Against the Giants, Lions, and Bears. Teams who were already pretty generous to wide receivers, also teams who were pretty generous in terms of giving up touchdowns to wide receivers. So this week, he's going up against a Denver defense that has given up only 5 touchdowns to wide receivers the entire year. That's the fewest in the NFL. So I'd be tempering my expectations, but I'm still fine starting him if he's my best option. I think we have to temper expectations on Colts pass catchers this week going into Seattle, right? Like, it looks like Phillip Rivers is starting for the Colts this week. When we saw Riley Leonard last week, he was doing all right. Like, if Riley Leonard was starting this week, throw these guys out there, but now we have to throw tendencies out the window for this team, for Phillip Rivers, what he used to do like 10 years ago, whatever it is. But, we have no idea what the situation is going to look like this week. I think we have to downgrade all Colts pass catchers. And again, if Leonard plays, I'm going to throw in, all these guys, right? Especially Michael Pittman. Now, Daniel Jones, he was playing at a high level. Right, that allowed Michael Pittman, Alec Pierce, Tyler Warren to thrive, but it's going to be tough to trust any of them. And, I think Pittman, who, he has a tough overall matchup, but they play a lot of 2 high safety coverage. Seattle does, so like good schematically for him. And Warren, great overall matchup. One of the best matchups for tight ends is going up against Seattle. Those might be the 2 receivers I'm still fine putting in my lineup if I have to this week, even if Rivers starts, but with significant downgrades. Let's move on to some green light tight ends this week, okay? Let's start with the Ravens tight ends going into Cincinnati. You just start your tight ends against the Bengals, okay? The tight end 1s and the tight end 2s have done their thing. Look at Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid. Look at, Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely a couple weeks ago. Austin Hooper, right? Like, it's just a theme that's been happening all season long. It's really that simple. Mark Andrews had a modest day against them 2 weeks ago, 4 for 47 on 6 targets, but Isaiah Likely, same target number, but 5 for 95. Likely also had a touchdown last week, as well as another should have been touchdown, to be honest with you. And that momentum could continue against the Bengals defense, allowing 8 more fantasy points per game than any other team in the NFL. It's worth noting that Andrews is the one running more routes, 78% route participation for him compared to Likely's 55%, but Likely has been the one with a 19% target share compared to Andrews' 14%. Both have the same number of targets against the Bengals the last time around, so, fire both up. I do have Likely ranked one spot over Andrews. I might change that 14 times before Sunday. Fannin Jr. going into Chicago. He's becoming close to a must-start tight end with Shedeur Sanders, right? He's earning a 28% target share over these 3 weeks with Shedeur starting. Top of that, full-time 87% route participation is what you want to see. He's a tight end 4 overall. During this span with Shedeur, he gets a solid matchup against Chicago. He's a solid tight end 1 this week. And so is Kyle Pitts going into Tampa. Drake London's been ruled out again, so Kyle Pitts should be in lineups. 7 for 82 on 8 targets 2 weeks ago, 6 for 90 on 10 targets last week, and he should continue to rack up receptions this week. He finishes a top 6 tight end in 3 of the 4 weeks with Kirk Cousins this year. Very high 24% target share during their games together. Fire him up. Easy. Closer to the high end tight end 1 range. I got a red light tight end for you guys. It's Oronde Gadsden going into Kansas City. I don't think we can trust Gadsden this week, given what we've seen over the last several weeks. He hasn't had more than 3 receptions in his last 4 games. He's only had 1 reception in each of the last 2 games. He now gets a Chiefs defense who's barely given up any production to the position. I just wouldn't want to put my fantasy playoffs on the line in his hands. So I'm going to be trying to find another option. That's going to do it for this episode, guys. Appreciate you a ton. Good luck this week. Find me over on Instagram at Upper Hand Fantasy. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, feel free to do so. Maybe right now. It takes a second. Appreciate you guys. Peace.